So what happens when a global superpower just decides to tear up its own rulebook? For decades, the US basically acted as the world's policeman. Well, that era is over. A new America First doctrine is completely reshaping global politics. So how does this new way of thinking actually play out in a real-world crisis? We're about to find out, and we're going to use the ongoing crisis in Venezuela as our critical test case.
Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll start with the big picture, what this new grand strategy is all about. Then we'll dive right into Venezuela to see it in action. After that, we're going to look at the single biggest obstacle to any solution, the military. And then we'll explore some pretty chilling war game scenarios of what could go wrong, before finally asking, is there actually a way out of this mess?
You know, this one sentence says it all. It's taken directly from the new national security strategy, and it's a huge declaration of intent. That whole image of America holding the world on its shoulders, yeah, that's being officially retired. The new philosophy isn't about carrying everyone else's burdens anymore. It's about pragmatically choosing which ones actually serve America's own interests. All right, so let's kick things off with Section 1, a new worldview. This is really about getting our heads around the fundamental shift from being a global interventionist to having a much more focused regional power mindset. Think about it. For decades, U.S. foreign policy was all about global primacy, spreading democracy, getting involved in conflicts thousands of miles away. But the new strategy looks at all that and says, hold on, that actually weakened America. So instead, it's proposing a much more pragmatic, almost transactional approach. The focus is shifting away from ideology and squarely onto core national interests, mostly right here in our own backyard, the Western Hemisphere. And the consequences of this are, well, they're profound. The strategy explicitly rebrands America's role as a fortified hemisphere power. Now, if you're a traditional ally in Europe, this is a massive shock to the system. The document is incredibly critical of their defense spending and makes it crystal clear that even long-standing alliances like NATO are not forever. The message couldn't be more blunt. You guys need to start handling your own security. Which, of course, brings us to Section 2, the Venezuela test case. I mean, it's one thing to have a grand strategy on paper. It's another thing to see how it actually translates to policy on the ground, and a real-world crisis is the ultimate test. Yeah, this isn't just some theory. Venezuela is a messy, complicated mix of everything. Security threats, energy market chaos, a massive migration crisis, and it's all happening right on America's doorstep. It is the perfect laboratory to see if this new, pragmatic approach can actually work where older policies have failed so spectacularly. So let's just quickly remember what the old U.S. strategy was. It was a policy of maximum pressure. And the idea was pretty simple. Use crippling, widespread economic sanctions to basically choke the Maduro regime and force a democratic change. But here's the thing. It didn't work. In fact, you could say it backfired. Badly. The maximum pressure campaign didn't get rid of Maduro. What it did do was worsen the humanitarian crisis for regular Venezuelans and push the regime deeper into the arms of U.S. rivals like China, Russia, and Iran. The proposed America First policy is a complete 180. It sees any economic activity in Venezuela as a zero-sum game. So the goal isn't just to punish anymore. It's to make sure that if business is happening, it's U.S. firms that benefit, not our competitor. So how does this actually work? Well, it's a playbook. A multi-step process designed to build leverage. First, you grant licenses to American companies to get a foothold in key industries like oil. That gets you a seat at the table. Then you use secondary sanctions to block competitors, making sure any economic revival benefits the U.S. You also jump in and assert control over Venezuela's massive debt to shut out adversaries like China and Russia. And finally, you reopen the embassy to get direct lines of communication going. It's all about using economic power like a precision tool, not a blunt sledgehammer. But, and this is a huge but, any plan, whether it's new or old, runs smack into a monumental obstacle. And that brings us to Section 3, the military linchpin. Because to understand this crisis, you absolutely have to understand the real power broker in Venezuela, its armed forces. See, Venezuela's military isn't your typical professional army. It's more like a sprawling corporation that's been given control over huge parts of the national economy. We're talking everything from oil and mining to food distribution. The survival of the Maduro regime depends almost completely on their continued loyalty. Which, of course, raises the million-dollar question. Why do they stay loyal? Why would you prop up a government that's presided over one of the worst economic collapses in modern history outside of a war? Well, the answer is a pretty potent cocktail of greed and fear. The senior officers have been given immense power and a ton of opportunities to get rich, both legally and illegally. So they're terrified of losing control of state companies and all those illicit revenue streams. But their biggest fear? It's what comes next. It's being held accountable for years of massive corruption and human rights abuses in a post-Maduro Venezuela. As the old saying goes, they hang together for fear of being hung separately. Okay, on to Section 4. Scenarios of chaos. This deep-seated military loyalty creates a terrifyingly fragile situation, and U.S. officials know this. A few years ago, the government ran a series of war games to simulate what would happen if the Maduro regime actually did collapse. And, well, the results were deeply disturbing. So, in the first scenario, a massive popular uprising finally forces Maduro from power. You'd think that's the happy ending, right? Wrong. The military, fearing for its own survival, turns its guns on the very people who just overthrew the regime, sparking widespread bloodshed and civil war. Okay, what about scenario 2? Maduro is ousted from within by his own inner circle. That doesn't bring stability either. Instead, it just ignites a vicious power struggle between rival factions inside the regime, all of them fighting to grab control in the power vacuum. And in the third scenario, a foreign military intervention actually succeeds in taking the capital. But this just triggers a long, drawn-out guerrilla war as regime loyalists melt away into the countryside and launch attacks on critical oil infrastructure, crippling the country for years to come. The conclusion from these simulations was chillingly consistent. No matter how the regime falls, the most likely outcome is prolonged chaos with no clear way out. And every single scenario predicted a new, massive wave of refugees fleeing the violence, which would create even more instability for the entire hemisphere. So, if a sudden collapse only leads to chaos, what's the alternative? This brings us to our final section, the path forward, and the incredibly difficult choices facing this new U.S. foreign policy as it tries to navigate a true geopolitical powder keg. Look, this proposed roadmap isn't some kind of silver bullet. It's a strategy of patience and pragmatism, and it comes with its own serious risks. The idea is to avoid that chaotic collapse by slowly and methodically building U.S. leverage from the inside. By getting American companies on the ground and controlling the flow of money, the goal is to gain enough influence over time to steer the country toward a more stable future. But this also raises some really difficult questions about whether you can really control a situation this volatile and whether it means you're effectively working with a brutal regime just for the sake of stability. And this leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is this new America First realism a smarter, more calculated way to manage an impossible situation like Venezuela? Or is it a cynical approach that risks propping up a corrupt system in the name of U.S. interests? The answer will have profound consequences, not just for Venezuela, but for America's new role in a rapidly changing world.